So floats are probably one of the most fundamentally hard things to understand about CSS and why we use them. But not only that, is when you do use them, things really tend to go wrong. Now, don't let that put you off. We're going to look at a few examples of floating. It really is simple in terms of how you float objects or elements, the fact that you float them left or you float them right. That is it. The rest of it is down to experience, how you position elements, how you sort of structure your markup, and how you clear floats as well. So we're not going to look at clearing floats in this video. In this video, we're going to look at actually structuring a basic, not layout, but look at sort of positioning blocks where we need them, or div elements where we need them. And in the next video, we'll look at a technique that we can use to actually clear floats. We will be looking at clearing floats in this video, but not actually, not a sort of practical use of clearing floats. So what we'll do first is start with the markup, just so we can sort of get this markup down, and then we'll take a look at the global CSS file to actually produce something on the page that looks sort of, fairly laid out. So the first thing I'm going to do is we'll look at just floating sort of any old element to the left or any old element to the right. So I'm going to go ahead and create a div. So I'm sort of pretending that I'm going to create a nice structure for my web page, and I'm going to have something floated to the left, maybe a sidebar, and then I'm going to have a content area maybe to the right. So let's go ahead and call this class sidebar. And I'm going to go ahead and type in here, this is the sidebar. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create another element. And this again will be a div, and I'm going to say this is the main content area. And instead of, additionally, we'll go ahead and give this a class of, say, content. So we have a sidebar and content. Let's go ahead here and just say sidebar and content, just so we've got the styles there so we can style them. So we've got a class of sidebar, class of content. Now initially these just look like this. They just literally look like text on the page, although we've got two block level elements. So we've got two divs with the display of block. These obviously sit underneath each other because they take up the full width of their parent container, which in this case is just body. So what we want to do is we want the sidebar obviously on the left hand side. We'll maybe give this a width of 200 pixels or 20%. And we'll give the content a width of, 600 pixels, or we could just go ahead and give it a width of 60% or, something, just to distinguish between the side and the main content area. So what I'm going to do is give these both background colors. Now, if you are experimenting with floats and you've never worked with floats before, setting background colors to elements can really, really help you determine where an element is actually sitting, just because then you have a background color to it. So let's go ahead and give a background color to the sidebar, and we'll just do a horrible red color, and we'll do the same with the content area. In fact, let's give them nice colors, so slate gray and dark slate gray. So now we've got a light grayish color for the sidebar and a dark grayish color-ish slate gray color for the content area. It doesn't really matter in the colors. So what do we want to do? Well, let's go ahead and give the sidebar a width. Now, as we know, it's a block level element, so we can give this a defined width. It will let us do this. So I'm going to say 200 pixels. For the content area, I'm going to go ahead and give this a width as well. Let's just check out the change here. So we can see that the sidebar is now, looking like more like a sidebar. The content area is going to be a width of 600 pixels. Now what we want to do is we want to float this left and float this not right but left. So that may be a bit confusing. But let's just take a look at sort of play around with these elements. We'll ignore the fact it's a sidebar and ignore the fact it's a content area, and we'll look at just playing around with them in general. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say I want the sidebar to float left. Now let's just take a look at how this sort of reacts. Okay, weird. So we floated this element left, which basically pulls an element to the left. It positions an element to the left. It floats it left. There are differences in sort of positioning, but we'll take a look at them a bit later. And the content area, now this looks weird because what's actually happened here is although this is 600 pixels, it's actually sitting underneath the sidebar. So it looks really strange. So we've got the sidebar here. If we were to just get rid of the sidebar, notice that this is simply sat behind it. So let's refresh to bring that back. And that's not what we want. It could be what we want, but it's really not good practice. So what we want to do is we also want to float the content area left. Now what this is going to do is it's going to float the sidebar left, but then what it's going to do is it's going to float the container left, making it sit next to it. So it's honoring where another floated element is sat. And in this case, we've now got two elements here sat next to each other. So we've floated them both left. It doesn't really matter what order, well, it sort of does. In the markup, if you were to have the content area beforehand, that means that it's the very left element because you're floating them both left. We could get away with this if for some reason we wanted the content at the top. We could get away with floating maybe the content to the right and the sidebar to the left if we had a main sort of wrapper around this. But that's sort of confusing things. You generally wouldn't do that because maybe the sidebar contains some navigation and you would want this to be the first thing that a user would hit semantically. You know, maybe a user has a screen reader. They might want to see the menu first and then see the content. It really depends on how you feel like you want to structure your page. So what we're now going to do is take a look at floating right and sort of how this affects things. So I'm going to float this element, this content element right. Now, you know, if you don't understand too much about floats, which is fair enough because it can get a while, can take a while to grasp this subject, you would expect this maybe to stay in the same position because you've got left and right. However, because our parent container is the body, you can see the orange strip, which looks a bit strange at the moment, we'll talk about that in a moment, is the full width of the page. So because we're floating the content right now, that sort of fills and honors the parent's width. If the body was half the size, this would come in a little bit. So that's basically what floating left and floating right is. There's no float middle or, you know, float top or float bottom. It's just float left, float right. So what we want to do, well, you can use float none if you want, but there's not much point. What we want to do now, though, is take a look at wrapping this all in a single container, and we're going to give this a background color. This will allow us basically to look at clear fixing and why floats do actually mess your layout up. Or what we could do, I suppose, is if we were to refresh with the float left and float left, we could go ahead and in the main content area create another two elements. So we could say I don't know, first half, and we'll give this a class of just say first and second. Oops, first and second. It doesn't really matter what you call the classes. For now, we're just learning. So we've now got first half and second half. So we've got exactly the same scenario as we had when we created the sidebar and the main content area. But now we've got these within this area. Now you might be thinking, why are we doing this? Well, we're pretty much laying out what you may class as a standard page. So I'm generally repeating things here, but this is probably not good practice to keep defining float left, float left. You may have a float left sort of hook in your page. We'll look at that at the end of this video. But for the first and the second, we want to float the first one left, and we want to float the second one left also. So we're floating everything basically left. And you can see here now that we've got float left, first half and second half. So here we are here. So now what I want to go ahead and do is I want to go ahead and say I want this to have a width of 50%, and I want this to have a width of 50% also. And I'm going to go ahead and set the background color to CCC and the background color here to DDD, for example. So there we are. Okay, so now that we've got these, let's go ahead and take a look at just maybe putting a little bit more content in here. we just say down a little, we come down with a paragraph break there, and you can now see that this is sort of starting to come together. Now, the reason I've done this is I want to look at the subtle, the massive difference and the problem that you'll see if you want to float second half right. And this may be the case. You might want to say, well, you know, why am I floating these next to each other? I might want to float this right, so the second one goes right. Now, you don't see a massive difference here. Everything's the same. So we could obviously still float this right. Now let's take a look at just sort of scrapping this, and we'll look at another example. And this is something you may come across and, you know, sort of think, oh, why isn't this working? It's supposed to work. So I'm going to go ahead and create a div here with a class of container. And within this, I'm going to place 2 items, and I'm going to call these boxes. So we'll give these common styles. So in the first box, I want this to be, you know, I just basically want these to look like boxes. So the container is going to have a background of, say, DDD. We'll just take a look at what this looks like. At the moment, you won't see it because there's nothing sort of in it. But with the boxes, we might want to say, I don't know, first box, second box. So this is going to force a height on the container, and you can see that we've got a grey background and these 2 boxes. We want to go ahead and style these boxes out. So I'm going to give these a width of 200 pixels. I'm going to give these a height of 200 pixels, and I'm going to give these a background of red. So what's going to happen now is we have 2 boxes, one sort of, well, they're on top of each other at the moment. But what I want to do is, and we spoke about this a little bit earlier, I'm going to create a hook. And this is going to be a float left hook and a float right hook. Now, it doesn't have to be called float left. It could be pull left, pull right, or left right, whatever you want. But I'm going to give these a float of left and a float of right. So what we're not doing is we're not doing anything fundamentally different from applying these styles directly to the box. But what it means is we can just say float left on here and float right on here. Just, you know, give the class, because when you're floating, you'll, you know, probably have a class that you'll want to just apply to it and not have to write the property again and again. Now, the reason that we've done this is because you can now see that there has been a little bit of a problem. And this is the fact that the container has now pretty much collapsed. We have an element floated left and we have an element floated right. Now, what happens if this was to be float left? Okay, so we get the same thing. If the container was float left, it doesn't change anything. So something's happened here that's meant that these elements have collapsed in a way. Now, let's go ahead and just try out a few things and just play around with this. I'm going to write some text inside the container without, you know, not in an element. And when I refresh, you can still see this element here. However, the reason this has happened is because I've applied a height and a width to these elements. Basically, if I was to get rid of this and then maybe fill up the first box with, I don't know, in fact, let's do this in our CSS file. So I'm going to get rid of the width and height just for now, and I'm going to go ahead and say first box break test, and you'll now see that that will still sort of fall over. Now I'm going to do something, and this is going to, if you're not already confused, confuse you even more, and I'm going to float the container left. Now you can see it honors the height of the boxes within it. So what the hell is going on here? Because this is so confusing, and this is probably one of the main reasons that people get so confused with floats in CSS. Well, floats in CSS really aren't meant for, you know, laying out purposes. They're not meant to lay out websites. We've gone from using tables to floats to lay things out, using maybe grid systems, pre-built grid systems, or just sort of going at it alone and just building a layout. We're yet to get full implementation at the time of recording for things like the CSS grid system or CSS grids and Flexbox. So we're now stuck with this problem that we have to deal with, you know, things like this. You know, this is a perfectly valid markup. There's perfectly valid CSS on this, but the container now has collapsed. So we can use something called clear. and this is a CSS property called clear, which basically clears floats. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to create a clear class, and I'm going to go ahead and say clear both. Now what this is going to do is it's going to clear both left and right floats. We can use clear left and we can use clear right, but we generally clear both because this works for left and right elements unless you only specifically need to clear left, and in that case you'd use that. So what is this going to do? Well, we could apply this to the actual container, but that's not going to do anything. In the next video, what we're going to do is look at a solution that will actually clear floats properly and work cross-browser. But what we can do is, just to demonstrate this, I'm going to go ahead and create a span element at the bottom here, and I'm going to go ahead and give this a class of clear. Now you'll notice that this doesn't quite work because this isn't a block display. So what I can do is go ahead and say display block, because a span by default is display an inline. Now what this has done is, because we've set this as a display block, removing the inline of the span, and we've cleared both, we've actually cleared the left and the right floats. I can change this to left and see what it looks like, where it behaves exactly the same, and I can change this to right, it behaves exactly the same. But clear both has basically said, right, after this point where I've added this markup, I want to clear the left and the right floats from here, and I want the container to act as if, you know, this is just normal content, it's not being floated. So this is a workable solution, it does work. However, it does add additional markup on your page, so you might want to look at an alternative solution. But in this video, what we've done is looked at basically laying out a page with a sidebar, a main content area, and floated things inside of that. We've looked at left and right floating, what happens when we add a container and, you know, we have something floated left and floated right. We've looked at this float left and float right shorthand way of floating, and we've also looked at clearing as well. But in the next video, we're going to look at a sort of cross-implementation, cross-browser implementation of actually clearing elements on the parent container. So we'll take a look at that next.